Good morning, everyone. Really warm welcome to those of you who've joined in the room and everyone joining online. I'm Madeleine Gabriel. I'm the Director for Sustainable Future here at Nesta, which is our area of work that focuses on decarbonising UK homes, and I'm really pleased to be chairing this event today. I've got a brilliant panel. I'll introduce them all briefly. So to my right, I've got Dr. Jan Rosenow. He is the Principal and Director of European Programmes at the Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP. Then Daniel Sorafjord. He's the Aira Group CCO and Aira UK CEO. Then I've got Charlotte Lee, who's the Chief Executive of the Heat Pump Association here in the UK, and Paul Kenny, who's the Director General of the European Heat Pump Association. So lots of perspectives, loads of expertise on the panel. Today's event's part of a series that we're running at Nesta called How to Make Good Things Happen. And the idea is to look at where there's been progress or interesting work elsewhere, really dig into it and see what we can learn from it. At Nesta, we work across a few different areas, including quite entrenched problems in health inequality, childhood inequality, and of course, climate change. And for all of you who are also in that space, sometimes that type of problem can feel overwhelming. But it's really useful to remind ourselves that these problems aren't intractable, and we know that because we can see where others have been able to make some progress. So the idea of this type of session is a kind of appreciative inquiry. What can we learn? Evidence-based optimism, as some people call it. So to Sweden, why are we looking at Sweden? I think it will be quite familiar to many people here that the Nordic countries have made more progress on heat decarbonisation than most other European countries. They've certainly got more heat pumps in those countries than elsewhere in terms of total numbers, but also far greater numbers of heat pumps per capita. And Jan will talk us through the detail in a second. So we really want to dig in and work out why that is. I want to say up front that when we do comparisons between the UK and other countries, the intention is really not to do the UK down. And I know that sometimes these sorts of comparisons can come across in that way, and in some way sort of be received as a critique of UK industry, or sort of saying that there's some failings here. Actually, we want to switch that round and look at, well, what's working well elsewhere and what can we learn? There'll certainly be some contextual factors about what's happening in Sweden and other countries that won't be transferable to the UK. Some elements of our context that we can't change, like maybe the fabric of our existing housing stock. But I think our starting assumption is that actually a lot of the things that are working well elsewhere have been enabled by choices, things that actually can be changed. So we want to really get under the skin of that and see if there's things that we can transfer to the UK. So the structure of the event today is that in a second I'll pass it over to Jan, who'll give us a talk about what actually is happening in Sweden. We'll have some discussion with the panellists. We'll start by digging into the Swedish case study a bit more, and then we'll broaden out to other countries because we've got a lot of expertise on the panel about what's going on in other European countries too. And then we'll open up to questions from the floor and online. So Jan, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I remember very well when, I think it was a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, I spoke to the chief exec of the Swedish Heat Pump Association, and I asked him, why is it that people in Sweden don't buy fossil fuel boilers anymore? And he looked at me and couldn't really understand the question. He said, like, nobody even asked that question, we just buy heat pumps. And he was so puzzled by the question, which for me, as someone who lives in the UK and also does a lot of work in continental Europe, this is the question. How do we actually persuade people to make the right choice that is better for the climate and ultimately better for the energy system and for their pockets? And in Sweden, this was no longer a discussion, according to the chief executive of the Heat Pump Association, of course. But that story stuck with me. And today I'm just going to spend a few minutes to sort of look at the Swedish story and what we can potentially learn from it for the UK and elsewhere. And I have a few slides. I hope they will work. I'm just going to click on this. Yes, there they are. So I'm just going to start. I have 4 slides, very simple, and it's mainly some data points just to sort of show you a little bit what Sweden has done. And the first slide I have for you is just to show the annual installations in Sweden since the early 1980s. And what you can see here is the annual installation rate in Sweden. Just to put this into context, so right now Sweden does about 200,000 heat pumps per year. That varies a little bit year by year. The latest data for the UK, I don't know, Charlotte, whether you're going to present an estimate later on in the panel discussion, but I think last year maybe 70,000 roughly, could be a bit more, depending on whether we count in air-to-air heat pumps. maybe it's 100,000, I don't know, but it's certainly compared to Sweden, this is impressive, right? This is an impressive number given the size of the country. So the second point I wanted to make is when you look at when most of this deployment happened, it actually happened in about 2 decades. There's some that happened early on, and there was a phase of preparing the market, but really most of the deployment, you can see, started in the early 2000s, and it's happened in just about 2 decades. It's not done yet. There's still properties that need new heat pumps and haven't been retrofitted with heat pumps yet, but Sweden has come a very, very long way. I sometimes hear people say on social media that energy transitions will take centuries. They have read Václav Smil. I don't know whether you know who he is, but he's written several books on how long it takes to transition. Well, this data, to me, actually makes me hopeful. And I'd like the title of this session, how to focus on what could be a good thing that we could be doing, rather than just be depressed by the negativity that is so often prevalent in the discussion. The second point I wanted to make on this slide is that when you look at the kinds of heat pumps that have been installed, you will see in the light blue here, or turquoise color, that is air-to-air heat pumps. And in the early days, it was mainly ground source heat pumps, some air-to-air, some air-to-water, but air-to-air heat pumps dominate the Swedish market. Very different story to the UK, where most of the residential installs almost exclusively are air-to-water heat pumps. And in fact, the government fundings programs currently discourage air-to-air heat pumps because there's a lack of funding for them. But in Sweden, they are the dominant technology. And maybe we can get into that later in the discussion, why that is and what the differences are. I don't have time in my little speech to go into that. But that's an important difference to the UK, is the kind of technology that has been installed. You probably have air-to-air heat pumps even in this building, I would imagine. They are everywhere. And Nathan, who is in the audience, often points out that the journalists who hate heat pumps and write articles about them usually sit in a building that is heated and cooled by a heat pump. So air-to-air heat pumps are also quite common in the UK, but not in residential buildings so much. Second slide. This is, it's a very busy slide, and some of you will have seen this before, but I think it's important to show it for 2 reasons. One is that it shows the penetration of heat pumps in Sweden. That is on the x-axis here, and Sweden is over here. It shows the number of heat pumps installed per 100 households. So this is the current stock of heat pumps. So in other words, in Sweden, almost half of the population, in statistical terms, have a heat pump. Yes, some buildings might have 2 or 3 heat pumps, but not all of them. It's a very high penetration compared to other countries. You see the UK is right here. I think Hungary is the only other country that is last, and the UK is second to last. That might have changed a bit. I mean, this data is out of date. It's from a paper we published in Nature a couple of years back using 2020 data. So it has changed for sure. But the main point I wanted to make really is that Sweden is standing out in being one of the countries with the highest penetration. Norway is in front of Sweden. That's the only other country we could find with a higher penetration of heat pumps. The second, and also I think very important point here, is that when you look at the y-axis, this shows you how cold it gets in the different countries. This is the number of heating degree days. I guess not all of you know what that means, and you don't have to. It means actually how cold it gets in a country in an average year. So the higher up you are, the colder it gets, the more cold days you have. Don't ask me exactly about the metric. It's very confusing because it's actually not the number of days. You can't have more than 365 days in a year. If you want to know exactly what that is, you can look it up. But it's a metric that is commonly used to measure how cold it gets. So you see Sweden up here, one of the coldest places. Look at Finland, Estonia, Norway. So there is a clear correlation that the countries with the most heat pumps are also the countries with the coldest climate. And that seems counterintuitive because people keep telling me on the social media every day that heat pumps don't work when it's cold. And maybe we can get into that. I know Paul has tested heat pumps in Ireland, came to very similar results, that they actually do perform pretty well if installed well. They can perform well even during very cold temperatures. And Sweden gets pretty cold in the winter. There's more to this. It's a bit more complex, but I think we can get into that in the panel discussion. My third slide is on the policy, a bit of a story where how this has happened. And this is from a paper that is now quite dated. It's from a UKIRK report that came out almost 10 years ago, I think. And this paper looked at the policy that was driving heat pumps and how heat pumps markets have changed over time. And really the main trigger, and I talked to Charlotte about this before the panel and my talk, the main trigger for Swedish heat pump policy can be traced back to the 1970s, the energy crisis. Sweden burned a lot of heating oil. That was the main source of heating in Sweden. And the energy crisis led to sky-high oil prices, and that triggered the Swedish government to invest in new technologies, R&D, research and development, grants for heat pumps, loans. It took a while. You can see that the numbers on my early slide and also the numbers here in terms of installations are quite low. The main thing that really changed that was, in my view, the carbon price that when it was introduced in the early 1990s that lowered the so-called spark gap, I come back to that in a minute, and made heat pumps a much more economic proposition, more attractive to consumers. There's also been other issues like consumer trust in the technology that Sweden, I think, addressed pretty well early on, because there were issues as well in Sweden. The same issues we face in the UK, with some poor installations that are being carried out, with a lack of customer redress when things go wrong, and Sweden has handled this pretty well. Surely not perfect. It can't just be copied and pasted into the UK context, as you said. But there are some lessons to be learned that it's important to have consumer reassurance and build trust in the technology. And then the last phase, where we're now really here, is I think, where the market has gotten very mature. You have a very active heat pump association. You have high trust in the technology. People know it. And almost all new heating equipment that is not district heating, so single-family homes in particular, is almost all exclusively heat pumps. There's no other technologies like gas boilers don't exist anymore pretty much, or oil boilers. It's mainly heat pumps, with some exceptions. Final slide, and then we can move over to the panel discussion. So I wanted to talk about the spark gap a little bit more, because I think that is one of the key lessons perhaps that can be learned also from the UK perspective. So what this shows you, and sorry for you at the back, it's hard to read. You don't need to read the individual country names. What I plotted here is the heat pump penetration, how many heat pumps are being sold in 2023 in each country. That's on your y-axis. And then on the x-axis, that's the ratio between electricity to gas prices. So if you are right over here, they almost have electricity prices that are 5 times as high as gas prices per unit of energy. And if you're all the way over here at 1, they're at the same rate. And what you find is that the lower that ratio, the more heat pumps you get. That's not surprising because, of course, that drives your cost savings. If you have a ratio of, say, 4, you need to have a difference in efficiency of at least 4 to make up for that difference in price. And currently, it changes all the time in the UK, of course, as it does in other places, but currently the UK spark gap is somewhere around 4, depends a bit on which tariff you're on, and that makes it really hard to make savings very visible for consumers. Yes, they're time-varying tariffs, but for the average customer, there are no big savings to be had unless they are smart and do what some people have done and use heat pumps flexibly and have a time-of-use tariff. Maybe we can talk more about that in the panel discussion. I think that gives you a bit of a flavor what Sweden has done. Sort of huge success story in terms of the deployment, but a quite checkered history with lots of policies playing a role there. And primarily, I think the economics and having a carbon price on gas and heating oil early on made a huge difference in the Swedish context. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to what the other panelists have to say. Thank you.
Really clear, really giving us a good overview of what's going on. Daniel, I want to come to you first. I'd really like to explore a little bit more about what Jan said right up front, which was that for the Swedes, getting a fossil fuel boiler just is a question. Is that just what the Heat Pump Association says, or is that true?
Having lived sort of the 35 out of the first 40 years of my life in Sweden, and growing up actually through this exact period, I can certainly attest to that. And it's, in fact, I moved to London when I was 40, and it was because with hydro and a lot of nuclear, electricity prices were much lower than what the oil prices became through the oil crisis. And then as electricity price got more expensive, we upgraded direct electric to a heat pump, which of course then made it sort of. Absolutely, if you're 40 or younger, then you will not have more or less seen a fossil fuel boiler in your life.
No real memory of it.
No.
What do you, Jan, you first, what do you consider particularly innovative about Sweden's approach, if anything?
I think policy stability, that has been very important, because what we find is that countries that adopt programs that are short-lived and don't have long-term certainty, make lots of changes, they don't provide that reassurance to investors, to industry. If you want to invest in training as a small SME and you don't know whether that program is going to be around next year, you're probably not going to make that investment. And I think that's key to me. And that Sweden seemed to have got some of that right. Probably not everything. I'm sure there's things that are not working even today, but they got that right. And I think having that carbon price that was increasingly raised. I can't remember how many years were between the increases, but it was gradually increased. I think that helped as well, because it gave people that trajectory of what was going to happen. So I would point to stability and having that long-term outlook in terms of the economics.
Would you add anything to that?
No, I think, talking about carbon pricing and maybe then relating it back to the UK, it's really interesting, right? Because a fair bit of this spark spread that you talked about is actually that green electricity has 900% more environmental tax than dirty fossil fuels. So in reality, green electricity is paying the environmental costs of dirty fossil fuels in this country, which is, I think, if most people took a step back and thought about that, it's just completely bonkers. There's no other word for it.
Yeah. Come to Charlotte. What do you see, if anything, sort of innovative or different about Sweden's approach that you think stands out?
I think, talking to Jan earlier, the oil crisis in the 1970s, that was 55 years ago. So what they did 55 years ago has really set the scene for where we are now and set that boundary or the vision really for where we're going and where we're getting to. The investment in electrification at that time, the very clear message and focus almost on the energy security. So from a consumer point of view and an acceptance point of view, rather than importing oil, they were generating homegrown electricity, which allows a buy-in and acceptance of the vision, of the journey, and from the sounds of the narrative has been very clear and has engaged with consumers at that from the very start, in the sense of we're doing this investment to provide energy security and to bring down the running costs for the consumers. So they're on board at the start. I think the tricky situation that we find ourselves in the UK is that we've got a very well developed, cheap gas network that consumers are very familiar with, and to transition and to bring them along that journey of transition and the messaging around the narrative to how we move away from that in a way that isn't scary and doesn't put the cost on them directly, or it's gradual rather than sort of dumping it, is really something that we should, that I think we will learn from and we will move to in this country. The carbon prices, the gradual rising, the government are looking at the levies that Daniel just spoke about and rebalancing those, but the challenge is, where do they go? And in the UK, the democratic system that we're in with the 5-yearly election cycles mean that those difficult decisions are difficult from a politically palatable point of view, not just from a net zero target longevity visionary point. So, the key really is that we need to bring the electorate, the consumers along the journey, and make it financially viable, economically viable as well as environmentally viable. But when the budget is tight, and I'm talking HMT's budget's tight, that's I think what's tricky in the UK currently.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I mean, you've talked about policy stability and having that long-term vision, but also being able to, I suppose, communicate with the electorate over the long term and tell that story about why something's important. And perhaps having a crisis makes that communication a bit easier. But obviously, it sounds like Sweden's had to maintain that kind of narrative for quite some time when probably the memories of the crisis have faded. So maybe there's something that we can learn from that.
And I guess, but perhaps we're starting that journey now. Yes, I know it's 55 years behind Sweden, but with GB Energy, the focus really is on electrification. The message from the government is energy security, stop importing the gas. We need to move away from it. And hopefully that we will do what Sweden have done in 55 years in a lot shorter time.
Brilliant. Go for it, Dan.
Maybe just adding some positivity to this as well. So the UK has 25 million fossil fuel boilers. Now, fortunately, 1.5 million to 2 of them break every year. So if we wanted to change this, creating a good, clear, alternative where consumers benefit from the fact that they are 4 times more efficient, and making it clear that this is the way forward, in 10 years' time, we would burn through, pun intended, the 25 million dirty fossil fuel boilers we're using. I think one of the things that really holds that back today as well, in stark contrast to Sweden, is also planning policy red tape, where half of these 1.5–2 million customers whose boiler break require planning permission to be able to fit something. You can fit a jacuzzi in your backyard that's going to consume more energy. You can fit electric showers and storage heaters wherever you want, but you can't put a small device in the back of your garden that's going to make your sort of CO2 footprint 75% smaller. And nothing like that has ever existed in Sweden. If you want to fit a heat pump, fit a heat pump.
There's no planning.
There's no planning, and we have tens of people already early into our company's story, working on administration of people's planning permissions, costing hundreds of thousands of pounds for us as a business, and in all honesty also means that most customers give up because you have a 2 to 10 month period of uncertainty. Very few families will accept 2 to 10 months without heating and hot water just to do the right thing for the environment.
So one of the hesitations about removing planning restrictions on heat pumps here is around noise and the disruption to neighbours. How do the Swedes deal with that? Do you just get on with it, or did you find in practice it's not a problem?
I think since Nesta has done some brilliant work on this, I think you would actually be an even better. Let's not even talk about Swedes. Let's talk about Brits, and the studies that have been done in the UK say that there is no problem with putting heat pumps in your back gardens. In Sweden, it was never even a question. Without being prejudiced, maybe that has to do with Sweden not having a very strong vested interest in fossil fuels and creating maybe those problems to slow down progress.
Thanks for mentioning our work on this. I mean, we recently published some modelling research showing that sort of heat pumps in high-density areas don't really create cumulative noise. You're always going to hear your nearest heat pump, and most of them are very quiet, but adding extra heat pumps in an area doesn't create a noise nuisance. I wanted to dig into a couple of other things, because Jan, you picked out a few sort of key factors in Sweden's experience. So let's talk about air-to-air heat pumps, first of all. You mentioned that they are predominant in heat pump installations in Sweden. Perhaps you and others on the panel might want to tell us, why is that? Actually, maybe Paul, I'll come to you because you've not come in yet.
So in Sweden, they were generally replacing direct electric, so you didn't have an electricity capacity problem. And depending on the development of the electricity grid, if you have a much stronger grid with a much higher average design per household, it's a lot easier putting the likes of an air-to-air heat system. So, for example, the Dutch have 1.5 kilowatt average design per household. It's going to be really, really challenging for them to move from gas to electricity. The Irish is 1.5 or 2.5, so it's an awful lot easier. It's gone now to 4.5. I don't know what it is in the UK, but I would hazard a guess it's quite similar to Ireland. So you can see that, I looked at one of those graphs with what did the heat pump replace in Sweden during the week. And about a third of them are replacing existing heat pumps, but 15 or 20 years ago, they were all replacing oil boilers. So what's happened is there's no oil boilers left to replace. I think they're at about 3% fossil fuel in their heating. And one of the things, the evidence-based optimism, I think is the language used. We can see that this works, okay? So there are countries that are colder than the UK and Ireland, where I'm from, and it works, and it's very simple. And I remember back in 2014 and 15, we started installing heat pumps, and the National Energy Agency told me, well, heat pumps won't work in Ireland's cold, damp climate or humid climate. And well, the evidence base does not support that, because look at Sweden. So, it's very easy when you're looking across the European markets, or even the US or Japan or anywhere else where there's very high degrees of installations. Anyone who tells you they don't work or they shouldn't work or there's a technical problem is just it's discussion of delay, discourse of delay. It's just complete rubbish. And I think we now know that this is possible. We can do this change. Their evidence is there all over the place. And then we now need to just attack one by one those barriers. So we don't have a planning permission issue in Ireland. They're very, very similar houses. They're similar law systems. They're similar building regulations. We adopted most of our building regulations from the UK. We adopted our government system from the UK and Ireland. And Irish people don't necessarily like to be compared too much to the UK, but it's a very similar journey we've just gone on. I've just finished in the Irish government, and over the last 4 years, we've just systematically targeted removing these barriers, putting in place the supports. Talked about a carbon tax. There's a unique opportunity. The new government has an opportunity now to put in place whatever the policies that are a little bit more difficult, because by the time they go back to the electorate, people will have forgotten. Now they're used to it. So 4 years ago, a three-party coalition in Ireland put a rising CO2 tax on fossil fuels, so rising by €7.50 per tonne every year out to 2030, ring-fence the budget 55% into the renovation budget. So it goes up by 100 million a year, and it's difficult to spend that money. And it's focused on the lowest income homes. They're getting heat pumps. They're getting the 55% into that, 30% into social welfare, 15% for farmers for an agri-environmental scheme. And that's how we got the social license for a carbon tax. Yeah. And that you can do it. There's evidence there. That was hard. I'd say every year at budget time, we had to really battle. We had to battle the opposition, really going for the jugular of you're making people's homes more expensive to heat. And you do have to fight that corner. But that discussion and discourse has been won in Sweden, and it's been won in Ireland. And there isn't a very different political system in Ireland than the UK. Maybe just to pick up on one thing that is important to think about. We need a relentless focus on the customer journey. I was just talking to Nathan earlier on. If you ring up a plumber in Ireland or the UK, and you ring up 20 plumbers, you might get one to say yes. The other 19 will probably say, or they would say if they were being truthful, I don't understand how to put one in, I'm afraid it won't work, and really please I don't want you to ask me to do that, if they were being honest. Whereas what you need them to say, like 20 out of 20 plumbers in Sweden, would be, no problem, I'll be around next week to do a survey and I'll get it in as quickly as possible. And that customer journey, the difficulty in subsidies, you put that on the installer so that they can just do it and the customer doesn't have to worry about it. You get rid of your planning permission, or you do planning permission zones, or you do some way to make the customer journey work so that when someone says, I'd like to invest in a heat pump, that there's subsidies, loan supports, and your barriers are removed so that they can just do it. Because until you have that, and until Mary or Joe or whomever pick up the phone and ring whoever put in their gas boiler and they get the answer, yeah, no problem. Until you get that, you haven't achieved what we need to achieve. And I think that's where I personally, and I've just started in the European Heat Pump Association, that is where I'm going to focus everything, is how do we get the customer journey to work in every market?
Yeah.
And I mean, thinking about the customer journey, what's very interesting for us who meet hundreds of customers and sit across their kitchen table every week is that unfortunately when the gas boiler breaks, most people here in the UK think I need to get a new gas boiler. In reality, they need a new heat source for their central heating system. that's what they need, but very few people obviously would think about it like that. So when you call your plumber, you say, my gas boiler broke, so I need a new gas boiler. When we sit across the kitchen table and educate people that, yes, your gas boiler is about to break, do you think it's a wise choice to invest in a technology that's 4 times more efficient, that's going to save 75 to 100% of the CO2, and you're not locking yourself into the fossil fuel track for the next 10 to 15 years, but rather electrification, where the cheapest new energy is green electricity? What do you think is the best choice to go forward? I have yet to sit next to a family that says, I'm going to go down the fossil fuel track. So it's so much about education as well, right? And this is where I think, again, government can play a very important choice. Everyone knows that have studied the data that electrification is the road not only to lower CO2, but also to lower bills and to lower energy usage. But that's not what the normal consumer thinks when their gas boiler breaks. They just think, I'm going to get a new gas boiler. No, that's not what you need. You can get something so much better if you just knew about it.
Just coming in on sort of the consumer journey and looking across to Ireland and Sweden, I think one of the big areas that we are missing in the UK currently, and yes, we have a consultation out that has yet to be responded to, but is not extending the gas network any further in the UK. So new build housing is a no regrets move to not put in to extend, as I said, the gas network in Ireland. New build housing all has low carbon heating technologies in Sweden. That's true as well. And I think heat pumps in new build housing does 2 things. It provides or enhances consumer confidence because you buy your new house because it's near your local school, or you want a bigger garden for your children to play in. You're not buying a house because of the heating system in the home is the point I'm making. So you get to your new property, your heat pump's there already, it works wonderfully, you tell your friends, your family, your neighbours, you accept it. I think it also will drive economies of scale because it will grow the supply chain, both from a manufacturing sales units into the country, but also the installer network, and it will grow their confidence too. So I think the 2 big asks, the policy asks in the UK market now are electricity and gas pricing, rebalance that so the lowest carbon heat is the lowest cost heat, and then introduce the future home standard as soon as practically possible.
And on new builds, right? I mean, I read a study the other day that a new built home where you put solar panels on the roof and a heat pump in will save £40,000 or more over the term of the mortgage, which might be a 20-year mortgage. So it's bonkers to put in old, inefficient technology rather than building new houses to sort of create the benefits that new technology allows to create. So I fully support that.
So we've talked a bit about the economics of heat pumps and how in Sweden the spark gap is much closer, and also in the 70s oil became very expensive and that created the economic incentive to move to electrification. And I think several people on the panel have said a key thing to do here is rebalance the policy costs or the levies on electricity and gas that would help reduce the gap here. Should we just talk about that a bit more briefly in terms of electricity pricing? Is there more that we need to do? Could we think about carbon taxation or other policies here that would help reduce electricity price versus gas even more? Yeah,
I can make a start. I mean, it's a vastly complex topic, and it's a difficult topic politically because there are trade-offs, right? If you increase the price of gas with a carbon tax, and you don't have in place what the Irish have done, it creates an equity issue. Especially lower income customers will have to pay proportionally more of their income towards that carbon tax, and might not have the ability to actually do anything about it because there might be tenants. They might not actually own the property, and the landlord is refusing to do anything about the heating system. So those are some of the real issues that also in Germany in the debate, maybe some of you will have seen that in the news. It was also covered in the UK media. In 2023, there was a huge uproar in Germany against the proposals from the German government to have something like a phased ban of fossil fuel heating, or a standard for renewable heating coming in. mainly because they didn't really have enough in place around the equity, enough funding and support. So I think just putting a carbon tax on gas in the current situation, with prices already being high and inflation being what it is, politically that's not going to fly. So that's much more difficult, and I don't think we can just copy what Sweden did in the 1990s. When energy prices are low, that's when you want to entertain that thought, and then have a sort of carefully thought through rebate, ring fence program, and maybe exemptions for especially low-income customers. But I don't think in the current climate you could say, let's have a carbon tax. So that's not going to fly. The main way, in my view, and the view of many others, is that you need to do some form of what is called rebalancing, and that is taxes and levies. So we have currently quite a lot of levies on electricity bills. There are several reasons for why that is, but everybody pays electricity. Not everybody pays for gas, because some people don't use gas for heating. They use something else. They might use oil or electricity, and that's why most of the levies are currently paid through electricity bills. And you could shift some of that to gas bills, and for the average customer, it wouldn't change a thing, right? If you consume on the average amount of electricity and gas, whether you pay the levies through gas or electricity doesn't really matter. You just pay the same amount. It really affects people who have very old buildings that are maybe not very well insulated and use a lot of gas, and they may also be in fuel poverty. And that's where we have to be careful. I think with just shifting the levies, we have to have some social safeguards here. One option, and then I stop, that I think is perhaps not the optimal option in terms of the economics, because you also want to set the right price signals across the entire market. But you could have an exemption. That's what they've done in Denmark, where you exempt homes with heat pumps from the levies or the tax for electricity for a certain amount of electricity. In Denmark, it's 4,000 kilowatt hours, I believe, that is taxed at the minimum tax rate that is allowable under European law, which is almost zero. And that would be one very pragmatic approach of providing an additional incentive. But that's not going to deal with the other incentives we need to change, which is also in the transport space, right? We want people to adopt electric vehicles. We want to send the right pricings across the economy. So it's an imperfect approach, but it could certainly it's better than nothing, and it's one that is politically perhaps more acceptable than a wholesale reform. But there's other options like partial rebalancing, and maybe Charlotte, you've looked at this as well in the Heat Pump Association. You have some views on that, or Paul from his experience in Ireland.
Yeah, I think there is an opportunity now. First year of government, there's always a lot more opportunities, and I think that is when it needs to be done. And I think it is important for the political system to have the administrative system have the capacity and competence to be able to propose things that are maybe a little bit more innovative. And one of the things that I've learned, and it's maybe something to share here, is when we started in government, we didn't have the capacity of our administrative system. We had the political will, but we didn't have the capacity. And I know from dealing with the UK over the last 10 years and particularly the last 4, you don't have the capacity in your administrative system. The UK had the world-class civil service 20 years ago. It was known across Europe as the best civil service. It's been undermined over the last few years. And I think you need to do that, and you need to do that quickly. And it's something to learn. Like, we've doubled the size of the Department of Energy in Ireland because we needed to affect large-scale change. We increased the capacity to do things. And we often use language like there isn't the political will, but often there is the political will and there isn't the administrative capacity. And I think that's a really important thing to know. There is an opportunity to rebalance costs, and I think that's part of it. I think we need to ensure that the gas price doesn't set the electricity price. Mm-hmm. We've seen this massive change in Europe in the last 3 or 4 years. We've built loads of interconnectors from the UK to the rest of Europe. And the markets are much more integrated. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of a hiccup in terms of the trading arrangements, and hopefully that can get solved. But what we've seen now is if it's sunny or windy anywhere in Europe, we see a very low marginal price of electricity. So it collapses right down because some plants can't change, and then wind and sun can provide very cheap energy, and you've got excess supply. So we see that coming through the UK. UK gas use is down 25% in electricity last year. I don't know if you're all seeing that. And that's flown through to Ireland. Oil is down 80%, gas is down 20-ish%. So that means that we've got more and more hours of the year that have very low electricity prices. So one of the things, and I know Octopus are about to publish a study shortly, and we saw an early briefing, and I won't put it out, but if you use an agile tariff and you take advantage of all of the investment, and the UK is a leader in offshore wind. When it's windy, you have a lot of power from that offshore wind. We need to convert that power instead of dumping it and paying people in wind farms in Scotland to switch off. Locational pricing in Scotland, you get really, really cheap power some of the year, and the flexibility of a heat pump means that you will get a lot of that passing through to consumers. It's not 100%, but if it's 20 or 30 or 15 at that flexibility, you can do that without any political challenges. That's just a regulatory change and the smart meters and so on. So there are 3 or 4 things that can really address that spark gap. We've seen it in other countries, right? Some of them are harder. Sweden has done it. Ireland has done it. It'll hopefully last through the next election. But none of those are insurmountable. And what I think the journey and the journey over the next 10 years really in energy policy for heat across Europe, and the UK is no different, is each of those little barriers, they just need a work plan. So we have planning permissions, we need an evidence base, the civil service need to change the rules and so on, and here's what it is in every other country. The spark gap, there's 3 or 4 solutions. The skills, there's half a dozen solutions. Each of those, they're all capacity issues. We need people to be able to work on each of these. You need to invest in the training, invest in the civil service, invest in the regulatory systems, invest in smart meters. It's all about investing to make that customer journey, go back to the beginning, work. And we can very much do it. And each of those are not insurmountable problems. So I think that's just a very important thing to say. Yeah. I'm going to have to run. Sorry, I have to take a train to Strasbourg. But the thing I'd like to leave as in everyone's head is this is absolutely possible. And it's just work. That's what it is. It's work. It's work by people who are paid to do the right thing for the right reasons. And if we can make sure that the civil service has the capacity, there is the political will. There absolutely is a political will in the UK now, without a shadow of a doubt. If someone came along to Ed Miliband and said, here's a 5-point plan that everyone knows how to deliver in the civil service, and you have the capacity to do it, he would say, yes, please. Guaranteed.
Could I quickly jump in there?
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I have noticed the new government has done, of course, as everybody else would have, is there's huge emphasis on electricity, right? There's been the mission-driven approach to decarbonize electricity, and that's great. And they got Chris Stark into the department, and that's brilliant. And now the government is looking for ideas, and they're really doing an awful lot. There's been very little on heating so far, and what I would like to see is that, rather than just focusing on the 20% of our energy use, which is electricity, we also focus on the other 80%, which is buildings, it's transport, it's industry. There's not enough yet anywhere near that, and I would like to see a mission for buildings, for zero carbon buildings, for zero carbon industry, for zero carbon transport, and just repeat that and not ignore it, because electricity is relatively easy. It's not easy, but it's relatively easy compared to the other sectors, and that's where the UK has made great strides. I mean, coal is going to shut down in less than 2 weeks now. Brilliant, right? But the other sectors have not decarbonized very much at all. The emissions are stagnant, and it's been ignored for too long because it's harder. But I think if to come back to, I think Paul, you said that this government wants to do things differently, and I think this is, if they can crack this, then I would say yes, they've done a job very, very well. But if they ignore it, I think then it's too easy. They need to focus on these other 3 sectors.
And I guess just to reiterate Jan's point, political leadership is key here. We need that strong focus, the policy certainty, the drive and the commitment from the government that will bring the sector along, that will bring the investors along, that will bring the supply chain along. I don't think that has come through yet, but let's be fair to them. They've probably had about 4 weeks where they've been able to say anything in amongst the recesses of summer and the party conferences. But I think that is a gap that needs to be filled quickly.
We've got, I think, about 15 minutes left now, so I do want to give some time for questions. Are there any questions in the room? Okay. We had one there, Derry, just in front of you. Okay. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Dave from Fornax. Just building on some of those comments, Ed Miliband may be stoked for heat pumps, and we know the folks at DESNZ is working super hard on this. Some of the barriers, though, you talked about, things like planning permission, new build housing sites, nothing really to do with DESNZ. If I think about, say, financing for heat pumps, that's in the world of the Treasury and the FCA, and there are very good reasons why that's not happening as well. So how do we actually get government departments to talk to each other? Is there anything we can learn from Sweden to actually build that mission control, build that real political will to do something? It doesn't seem to actually be the energy side that's the problem a lot of the time.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll take one more question and then we'll go to the panel. I think got lovely poppy on your jumper.
Thanks very much. My name is Maura Nicholson. I lead the behavioural science team at the Cabinet Office. I have two questions briefly. The first is, can you say any more about how the Swedish government spoke to the public about the heat pump rollout? What was the rationale given? What did they say? Anything that we can learn about how we might speak to the public here? And then second of all, thinking about transferability, I know, Jan, you mentioned you can't just lift things over from Sweden and apply them here. Just wondered how much you think the role of income inequality might play a role here. Obviously, Sweden's got much lower levels of income inequality, and more I'm feeling that actually it's quite a problem for low carbon technology, because if you have very few people with a lot of money and then a lot of people with not very much, that makes it much harder for those people to sort of invest in these sort of innovative products. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as a panel.
Thank you. So how do we get government departments to talk to each other, or to see a mission as all of governments rather than just one department? How did the Swedish government talk to the public about the transition, and is there anything we can learn about income inequality and how to, does that mean an insurmountable barrier for the UK where we have greater inequality, or are there ways to get around that? Do you want to come on?
Jump in first on the civil service and the ties between the departments there. So within those 4 weeks, as I've said, I have noticed the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero team very closely working with the team at MHCLG. So all of the conversations we're having with them at the moment about permitted development rights, about future homes and building standard, they're very aware that they are reliant on another team. They have these cross-departmental meetings, and they are working together to push that through. So it does feel at the moment like there is a lot of engagement between those departments, and the work that's going on is feeling positive. I mean, we are yet to see the published responses to those consultations, but the soundings are good for now. So let's give them some credit for a couple more weeks or months and see whether that continues. I've also noticed that within the department, within the cabinet team, there are some ministers with cross-departmental roles. So they are spanning trade and energy security, which I think should be very helpful. And obviously, Chris Stark, I know the Mission Zero, they focus on GB energy, but it was very clear when he was put into post that his role really is to draw all of those different departments together and work closely. So, I think I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that there is some positivity coming out of that. I'm not going to cover the Swedish consumer messaging piece. I'll leave that. But just on the income inequality piece, I think one thing that is missing in the UK at the moment is we have subsidy schemes to support heat pumps, a lot of them, lots of acronyms, but two specifically. So the energy company obligation focuses on those that are going to be never able to pay, so low income fuel poverty. Then we have the boiler upgrade scheme, which is focused on the able to pay, and there's a gap in the middle of those that don't quite meet the eco criteria, but cannot access bus. And I think that's the big gap, and I don't have the answer for that, but I think it's important to acknowledge there is a gap in that sector, in that space right now within the UK market. And I don't know whether Sweden did anything specific for that group of people, or if it was just the pricing that meant that actually it became economically viable to make that switch, both from an upfront cost and a running cost point of view over time.
So I will actually use a German example that is right here, right now, as one example of how to help. And I mean, as a Swede, as an IKEA lover, sort of design for the many, I think this is truly at also the heart of what we are trying to do. And in Germany, low-income households get a 20% additional sort of subsidy payment towards their low-carbon heating installation. So there is actually this acknowledgement that for this segment to drive to do their part. Yeah. And I think that's really one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is actually going back to sort of, yes, it's a bigger capital investment to get a heat pump versus getting a new boiler. But over time, they require less maintenance. They're much more efficient. If you combine them with a flexible tariff, if we think into the future of how, a house is a thermal battery. So by running the heat pump intelligently, you can truly drive down cost and get efficiencies. In reality, most people would save thousands and thousands of pounds. So they would save money, not spend money by getting a heat pump. But it's being able to pay for it as a monthly fee is what would allow that to happen. And whether it's through low-cost loans like the Scottish government has done on paper, it's very difficult administrationally to actually make it happen, but that's another thing. But on paper, it's a brilliant idea. Or if it's allowing companies like us to maybe own the assets on our balance sheets and sell it as a service instead, so that you as a customer pay 80 quid a month for a central heating system that's both efficient and that will always run, versus spending the money and taking the loan. Currently, that's not allowed, but there are clearly, the servicization of different products is something we're used to. That's how electric cars have had the growth that no one could have spent £70,000 buying an electric car, but getting it as a monthly fee is what allows people to do it. So those are two concrete examples.
Jan, do you want to come in?
Yes, maybe just to follow up from what Daniel said, and then I will get back to you on the Swedish communications approach. I mean, we've kind of been there before, haven't we, in many countries and in the UK as well, where we transitioned from coal heating to central heating and gas heating. That was a huge transition. Mm-hmm. And when you look back at the history of that, the resistance against that transition from the coal industry back in the day was fierce. In the Netherlands, they actually ran advert campaigns how great coal heating was and how terrible gas heating would be. And people would sometimes take it for granted that gas central heating is kind of the norm, but it hasn't always been like that. And there was a huge investment up front. You had to actually lay the pipework. You had to have radiators in rooms. There was nothing before. People had coal fires. And that's sometimes forgotten, I think. And we think heating just has to be something cheap that can be done quickly. Actually, some of the transitions in the past, they weren't necessarily cheap and quick, but they were long-lasting. And it's an investment that you make once, and then it's there for a very long time. But I wanted to maybe get back to you on the question in Sweden. And I would actually have to reread some of the papers I read months and years ago about this. But I think one of the key findings was that just running one-off information campaigns doesn't work. You need to have credible information that is there permanently. And in the UK, I think EST sort of used to serve that role very well when they had a lot of funding. I think that's been undermined, certainly in England. I mean, in Scotland and Wales, it's a different situation. But having a credible public agency that provides information and provides people with the information that they require to make those decisions is important, and not just doing a one-off campaign. Yes, campaigns can help to raise awareness, but I think that was the key learning, I think, from Sweden, to have high-quality information available. And very short point on the question over here about how to collaborate more. I mean, what I always thought was missing was, after the target was announced, 600,000 heat pumps, is having a credible plan that actually underpins it. Politicians love targets, and the main reason why they love targets is because they usually come into force when they're no longer in power. So they announce a target for 2030 or 2050, and it's great, right? You get some media attention, and you're doing the right thing, but actually developing a credible plan and then implementing it is really hard. And we haven't had that in the UK. You can sort of infer what the plan might be. Yes, you have some new build, some bus and eco, and then you have the clean heat market mechanism. But it's really not a very detailed plan. So I think that is a number one thing we need, a credible plan, and owned by the Prime Minister from the very top, and then broken down into the different pieces. Which department is doing what are the policies, how many heat pumps will this drive? That's totally absent. We don't have that. And I think we need that if we want to achieve those targets. We may as well say we have the targets, we never achieve them, then we don't need a plan. But if you want to achieve the targets, in my view, we need a very credible plan.
It's also a coherence, I think, so the Swedish example. So the boiler upgrade scheme is actually really good. I would say it's one of Europe's best subsidy schemes for heat pumps. But if you have planning permission, telling 50% of people, actually, you probably shouldn't get the heat pump, even though you get the subsidy for it. And then you have the energy prices or the spark gap where, it's not really encouraging low carbon energy, but rather encouraging high carbon energy. These things, people are smarter than that. They understand when things don't line up. And I think in Sweden, there were actually coherence. Long-term subsidies in place. This is the future. This is what we're doing. Energy prices driving savings from day one. No planning permission complications that if people actually wanted it, they could get it. And I think that's what's missing. There's no coherence in, there are lots of good initiatives, but unfortunately they don't go together.
I think we might have time for one more question for the room. And Izzy, are there any online? Okay, we'll go for one in the room, one online. I'm going to go there.
Hello, Dominic Herndl from Oakland. I wondered, is there any difference between the housing stock in Sweden and the housing stock we have in the UK? One of the things we talk about a lot is super high density population areas, lots of flats, terraced houses, don't suit a heat pump. If we all lived in large detached houses with lots of space, it would be simple. Is that the experience of Sweden? And if not, how did Sweden get around that housing stock challenge?
Good question.
Exactly the same.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right, we'll have one more in the room then. Okay, yes. Andrew.
Hi, I'm Andrew from Econic Heat Pumps. I just wonder if you could clarify for other people listening that even though Sweden may have different build qualities in the houses, that in England, UK, we're doing perfectly fine putting heat pumps into solid brick, uninsulated buildings. I know, Jan, you've got one in your thing, but could you just clarify, because some people might say, oh yes, well Sweden is different and they've got different houses and whatever, but just make sure uninsulated brick in the UK is doing just fine with heat pumps, if you can make that clear to those listening.
I think you've made that clear, Andrew. But yeah. Okay, let's talk about the housing stock then. Does Swedish housing stock differ? Does that make it fundamentally easier to put heat pumps in or not?
So, first of all, a heat pump is a heat source, and a gas boiler is a heat source that hits the central heat, the water that hits the radiators of the house. A heat pump can produce the same temperatures that a modern heat pump produces the same temperatures as a gas boiler if you wanted to. So if a house can be heated with a gas boiler, it can be heated with a heat pump. It's actually not more complicated than that. And then you can make it more complicated in how to run it super efficiently and so on. But literally, again, with the penetration we have in Sweden, yes, there are detached houses in Sweden, there are row houses in Sweden, there are apartments in Sweden. The distribution might be slightly different, but you wouldn't have heat pumps everywhere if not every house could be suitable. And I love it since coming to the UK when people tell me that winters here are so cold and it doesn't work. I mean, it's the worst day of winter is a nice spring day in Sweden. So it's interesting, really.
I think also just the development in terms of the heat pump sort of options that are available. It's not just single air to water or ground to water for individual properties that service one house. The shared ground loop and the move towards shared ground loops serve blocks of flats very well. The heat networks that will drive whole streets, whole terraces from waste heat recovery. There is a heat pump solution to pretty much every single housing type. It might not be what you would perhaps perceive to be your classic, air to water single unit install or your ground source. It may just do the heating only, and you have a different solution for your domestic hot water, for example. That's also becoming much more prevalent within the UK, with using things like thermal batteries for electric heating or direct electric for your hot water, and having a heat pump providing the heat source. So I think as well in the new build, if we look, they're used to laying pipework to run gas through. The market is moving to deliver solutions which will run ground loop networks under the new developments to deliver a big shared ground loop system with an individual little unit per property. So I think, the market is developing to offer solutions for all house types, and the electrification of heat demonstration project, which the interim results were published a couple of years ago now, but they made it very clear there is no big efficiency difference depending, it doesn't correlate to how energy efficient your property is. It showed that they operate efficiently in all house types. That was one of the report's conclusions. So I think we do need to move away from this idea that they only work in particular instances. And as Daniel says, it's a heating source. It would heat a barn with its doors open. It wouldn't be very efficient, but it would still heat it.
Yeah, last word.
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are some challenges in the UK housing stock. Like there will be some terrace streets where you don't really have a garden. There's a little yard at the back, and then the question becomes quickly, where do you put it? You can't put it at the front because that's usually not allowed by the local council. You don't really want to put it at the back because there's no, like, where do you actually, so that's where you then have to talk about sort of maybe a ground source approach, shared loops. So there are some properties that are more challenging, or old blocks of flats in London. But again, I've seen one in July that Kenza Heat Pumps did. It was 100-year-old flats, solid brick, and they retrofitted the entire tower block with ground source heat pumps. It works. It can be done. It might not be air-to-air or air-to-water heat pumps, and it might be more difficult. But I think every building can be heated with some heat pump technology. It might just be different to what is done in Sweden. I mean, one point of nuance perhaps, because in Sweden there's also, because it gets so cold and people often have complementary heating sources available, especially in rural places, having a wood burning stove, often for atmospheric reasons, but sometimes when it's really cold, it provides a top up. We don't have that in the UK, but my sense is that because our temperatures in the winter don't really go that low, we don't need it. But that's a difference in Sweden. On top of having a well-insulated housing stock, is that they do have some form of complementary heating. But to come back to the question, can you heat a solid brick house in the UK with a heat pump? Of course you can. There's a question about comfort. If you have really leaky windows and there's drafts coming through, you would want to fix that with whatever heating system you have. And of course, insulation will help to lower your running costs. But technically, you can heat a tent with a heat pump. Does it make sense? No, it doesn't. You want to fix the insulation with any heating system if it's really poor, but you don't have to before you install a heat pump. And I don't buy the argument that it's totally acceptable to install another fossil fuel heating system in a leaky building, but it's absolutely unacceptable to have a low carbon heating system. I simply don't understand the argument. Why do you apply such a strict rule to the low carbon option, but you're perfectly happy to install another fossil system, which will just pollute much more? So I think that was clear.
Can I end on an optimistic note? I'm conscious of the time, but I just wanted to say, and Jan said at the start about where we are currently with sales within the UK. So within the Heat Pump Association, we track UK factory sales, factory gate data on the number of heat pumps sold. And for the first half of this year relative to last year, we're seeing a 40% increase in the market, so a 40% growth in the UK market in terms of heat pump sales. And if you look at the installation, the workforce, which is going to be absolutely key, and we haven't really touched on that at all here, but vital to this transition. We've seen a 37% increase in Q2 this year relative to Q2 last year on the number of individuals that are choosing or who successfully complete a heat pump qualification. Now, what we don't know is whether they're going on to do those heat pump installations, where they are going to work. But it does show that there is an increasing interest across the supply chain. There's increased growth in the market in the UK, and there's an increased interest from the supply installation network to get involved in these technologies. I mean, I think a 40% growth sounds fantastic, but when you're starting from a relatively low start point, our data last year was around 60,000 units sold. We are not making up for the decline that we're seeing across the border in the EU, and I think that is also challenging investment investor confidence in the total market. And whilst the UK is seeing a growth, it's a relatively small growth. And so there is this big piece around, policy certainty, electricity and gas pricing, future homes and building standard. And I think you've hit the nail on the head, Jan, when you said, we need a clear message, a plan, a credible delivery plan from the government in order to see the growth and the commitment from everybody.
There's almost too much to talk about here. I'm going to bring it to a close because we've gone slightly over, but I want to really thank the panellists for taking part in such an interesting discussion. I do feel quite optimistic. I really liked Paul's message around, just picking off the problems one by one and solving them. And I think we've had quite a lot of insight and inspiration about how we might solve each of the problems we've talked about today. So big thank you to the panellists. Thanks very much for joining us.